You know what the problem is with this sector, Garrett. Nobody holds the line anymore. People show up where they don't belong, and nobody says anything because nobody wants the trouble. Somebody has to be the standard. That's why they put me here. Officer Wade Pruitt said that on a Tuesday morning in December, sitting in his cruiser with a coffee cup balanced on the dashboard, and his eyes moving slowly over the Millwood Memorial Cemetery entrance as 3 luxury cars turned through the iron gates. His partner, Kenny Ashford, was 26 years old and had been listening to variations of this speech for 3 years. He didn't ask what Pruitt meant by where they don't belong. He had learned that asking obvious questions earned you a look of patient contempt that lasted the rest of the shift. But before any of that mattered, before the boots crossed the east lawn or the handcuffs clicked or the December morning broke apart in ways that could never be put back together, there was a young man named Elijah DeWitt, and he deserves to be seen clearly before the story of what happened to his mother begins. Elijah was 29 years old, and he designed affordable housing, the way some people compose music, with the understanding that every single choice either opened a door or quietly closed one, and that the families who moved into his buildings had spent most of their lives on the wrong side of closed doors. His firm operated out of a converted row house in Columbia, South Carolina, small by intention, the walls covered in working blueprints annotated in his precise architectural hand, with comments in the margins that were equal parts technical instruction and personal philosophy. Wide hallways need to feel like somewhere, not just corridors between rooms. South-facing windows in every bedroom, because morning light in a room tells you everything about who the room was designed for. He had written that note at the age of 19 after his mother told him something in their apartment kitchen that he never forgot. Front porches on every unit. Not because the budget easily accommodated them, but because Elijah believed a porch was a political statement. It said the person living there had the right to sit outside their own front door and watch the world go by, and that the neighborhood agreed with them. He had been driving home from a site visit in Beaufort County when the tractor-trailer drifted across the center line on a wet November highway. No drugs, no speed. No explanation the universe was willing to provide to the people it left behind. Just the mathematics of a wet road and a drifting vehicle, and a young man in the wrong lane at the wrong moment carrying 231 completed designs and a lifetime of south-facing windows that would never be drawn. His colleagues remembered his signature, the same way his clients did, the same way his mother had understood it from the time he was a teenager bringing the drawings home on difficult days. Sunflowers. He brought them to every ribbon cutting, to every client meeting that ran long and ended in something good to his mother whenever a day had been hard enough that yellow felt necessary. He said yellow was the only color that couldn't be mistaken for anything but itself. You looked at a sunflower and there was no ambiguity about what it was announcing. The sunflower spray across the bronze urn at Millwood Memorial Gardens had been Nadine DeWitt's idea, ordered from the florist, in the same way she had done everything in the 34 days since the phone call, with the precise, forward-moving intention of a woman who understands that if she stops moving, she may not start again. If you had asked people in her neighborhood about Nadine DeWitt when she was raising Elijah in a third-floor apartment on 2 incomes, and a determination that no one ever fully saw the size of, they would have told you. She was a woman who paid her bills on time and showed up at every school conference and never, not once, let her son see the weight of anything she was carrying on his behalf. They would have described her the way you describe someone you respect from a careful distance, because she had always had a quality that made people feel simultaneously trusted and slightly held to account. What most of them did not know, because Nadine had never needed the information to be known, was that she had spent the last 21 years on the federal appellate bench. The Honorable Nadine DeWitt, Judge, United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. 468 written opinions, cases that had reshaped law in ways that moved slowly and quietly through the landscape of American justice, the way water moves through rock, finding cracks, widening them, changing the shape of things that don't know. They're being changed. But this morning, standing at the edge of Section 14 in Millwood Memorial Gardens with her hands clasped in front of her and her veil down and the December fog moving unhurried between the headstones, She was not a judge. The title lived in her the way a professional identity always lives in a person who has worn it long enough, present and structural part of the architecture of how she moved through rooms and courtrooms and conversations. But this morning, she was a mother at the edge of her son's grave, and the distance between those two things was absolute and complete. She wore a plain black wool coat, belted no jewelry except her mother's small pearl ring on her right hand, which she only wore on days that required it. Her veil was down. Her hands were clasped. She was a woman made entirely still by something too large to contain through motion. The permit had been filed 34 days after the phone call and 8 days before this morning, and it bore the number WC4471, issued by Millwood County, and listed on the public burial schedule for Millwood Memorial Gardens at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning, Section 14, Row 9. The florist had confirmed delivery. The funeral director had confirmed the arrangements. The grave had been opened and dressed in the careful way that grief, when it has money enough to do so, gets dressed for its worst appointments, artificial turf, concealing the raw December earth. The chrome lowering device reflecting nothing particular, the bronze urn resting in its place, and the sunflower spray laid across it, yellow against the gray morning sky, brilliant and unapologetic exactly as Elijah would have wanted. You looked at a sunflower and there was no ambiguity about what it was announcing. The people who had come were the people who come for someone like Elijah DeWitt, someone who generated loyalty without trying to. His college friends from Atlanta and Columbia, 6 of them, 3 of whom had driven through the night. His graduate school colleagues from the architecture program at Virginia Tech. Families from the Beaufort County Project people who had never met Nadine but who had known Elijah through the width of his hallways and the angle of his windows and the front porches he had fought for in every budget meeting because he believed a porch was worth the fight. And in the back arm in arm, Mrs. Odessa Carmichael and Mrs. Ruth Malone, the 2 elderly women from the block where Nadine had raised him, who had watched Elijah grow from the boy who fixed their screen doors without being asked to the man who put sunflowers in his blueprints as a professional signature. They had driven 2 hours for this. They had not considered not coming. Pastor Nathaniel Cole was already halfway through the 23rd Psalm when the morning changed. "The Lord is my shepherd." The words moved through the December air in Pastor Cole's measured and unhurried cadence, the voice of a man who has delivered these words hundreds of times at the edge of hundreds of graves, and who understands that what he offers in those moments is not sentiment which everyone present already possesses in abundance, but the weight and the rhythm of the language itself, something ancient and steady enough to stand in while the world comes apart around it. The fog drifted between the headstones of Section 14 in soft, unhurried ribbons, moving the way grief moves when it has nowhere particular to be, except present. The gathering stood in their dark coats around the open grave, the chrome lowering device catching what little light the gray sky offered, the bronze urn resting above the earth with the sunflower spray across it, yellow burning in all that gray, like something that refused to apologize for what it was. Nadine stood slightly apart from the others, not coldly, but in the way that a mother's grief requires its own geometry wide enough to hold everyone else's loss inside it, which means you cannot stand inside the group if you are also trying to hold the group together from outside. She had positioned herself where she could see the urn clearly, and she kept her eyes on it with the focused stillness of someone who has decided that she is not going to look away from this. She owed Elijah that. She owed him the full weight of being seen and not managed. Her hands were clasped in front of her. Her veil was down. The pearl ring on her right hand caught nothing in the flat December light, just a small presence, her mother's worn today, because today required it. Elijah's college friend James, a young man in a dark overcoat from Charlotte, stood 2 steps to her left. He had not spoken since the service began. He was holding himself very carefully in the way that people hold themselves when they are managing something they did not know they would need to manage until they were already inside it. The pastor's voice continued unhurried. "I shall not want, and the fog drifted and the sunflowers held their yellow, and for those 40 minutes before the boots came, the morning was exactly what it should have been. A group of people gathered around the grave of a young man who had deserved more years than he received, doing the only thing that can be done in the face of that particular mathematics, standing together in the cold, and saying the old words and letting the fact of it be real, which is the only honest response to the death of someone you loved. Nadine heard them before she turned. Everyone did. That was the detail none of them would forget when they told investigators and attorneys about it afterward. Not seeing him first. Hearing him first. The sound of those boots crossing the east lawn, heavy and deliberate, carrying in the cold December air, with a clarity that reached the gathering before the man wearing them came fully into view. The kind of sound that has intention in it that announces something before it arrives. The pastor stopped mid-verse. Nadine did not turn immediately. She kept her eyes on the urn for 2 more full seconds. She breathed in. She turned. Officer Wade Pruitt crossed the east lawn of Millwood Memorial Gardens with his utility belt creaking and his right hand resting near his holster, and his face wearing the specific expression of a man who has not in 18 years of this work once been required to explain himself to anyone he was walking toward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, blond hair cut close. His uniform pressed to a stiffness that made his shoulders look nearly twice the width of a reasonable man's. His black boots striking the grass with a deliberateness that said he was not walking, he was arriving, and arrival was different from walking because arrival asserted. He stopped at the edge of the gathering and let his eyes move across it with the inventory sweep of a man performing an assessment he has already completed before he began it. The open grave, the chrome lowering device, the bronze urn and the sunflower spray resting on it yellow against the gray morning. The mourners in their dark coats, their faces turned toward him now, the specific stillness of people who recognize what has just entered their space. The pastor with his Bible still open, words still on the page. This is a restricted area, not loud. The kind of voice that doesn't need to be loud because it is by the nature of what it represents the loudest thing in any space it enters. I'm going to need to know who authorized this gathering. James Elijah's college friend took one careful step forward. His voice controlled the way a voice is controlled by someone who has learned that control is protective. Sir, this is a private funeral. There is a burial permit on file with the county. I'll get to you. Pruitt said it without looking at him. His eyes had moved to Nadine. She looked at his badge number first, then his department, then his nameplate, then his face. The sequence of a woman who reads situations with the precision of long professional practice. When she spoke, her voice was level in the way that genuine calm is level, not performed, not constructed for effect, but the real stillness of someone who is not afraid and is also not interested in the theater of not being afraid. Officer Pruitt. She read his name from the tag. This is a permitted private burial permit number, WC4471, filed with Millwood County 8 days ago. The service is registered on the Millwood Memorial public schedule for 10 o'clock this morning. I would ask you respectfully to lower your voice. We are in the middle of a service. Pruitt looked at her the way he looked at everyone in this county who did not immediately recalibrate their posture when he arrived with the patient attention of a man who has decided that his own forbearance is itself a form of authority. What I'm hearing, he said slowly, is that you'd rather lecture me than answer a simple question. He shifted his weight. Let his physical size do what it had always done in these moments across 18 years of this sector, announce itself, take up space. Remind the person across from him of the arithmetic of the situation. Everybody's got a reason. They belong somewhere, he said. Let's see yours. My identification is in my vehicle, Nadine said, and her voice did not change, not in pitch or pace. It moved with the same calm steadiness it had maintained from the first word. I walked directly from the car to the graveside. I will retrieve it now. She had taken one step toward the cemetery lane where her car was parked when Pruitt said, "Stay where you are." She stopped, She turned back. Her face shifted. Not to anger, not to fear, but to the expression of a person who has just had a door closed that should not have been closed, and who is in the seconds following performing a rapid and thorough assessment of the implications, measuring the space between what is happening and what can still be changed. Her voice dropped one register. Not raised, deepened, with a quality that anyone who had ever stood before her court and argued a losing position would have recognized immediately as a signal that something important was being said and that it would not be said twice. Officer Pruitt, you are making a serious error. I have told you where my identification is, and I am willing to retrieve it. If you prevent me from doing so and proceed further with this contact, the consequences will be significant, and they will be fully documented. Pruitt heard the words. He processed exactly none of their meaning. What he heard, what he always heard when someone spoke to him in that register, in that tone, in his county, in his sector where he had been the standard for 18 years, was a challenge. A black woman at a cemetery on a Wednesday morning in front of witnesses telling him there would be consequences. People like you, he said. The phrase worn smooth by repetition, always meaning the same thing, regardless of what came after it. Always drawing the same line between the person saying it and the person receiving it. Always think they're the exception. He reached out and took her left arm above the elbow. She did not pull away. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform resistance in any form. She stood completely still and allowed Wade Pruitt to turn her and snap the handcuffs onto her wrists at her son's graveside, while the pastor stood with his Bible open, and the sunflowers held their yellow, and the 23rd Psalm waited in the cold air unfinished. Wade Pruitt had grown up 20 minutes from Millwood, the kind of small-town Virginia distance that sounds close on a map, but carries its own landscape of class and assumption and inherited certainty about who belongs where. He had enrolled at the state university and left after 2 semesters for reasons that he described when he described them at all as it wasn't for him, which was accurate in a way he had never fully examined. What wasn't for him was being in rooms where he could not immediately identify his position in the hierarchy, where other people's credentials or confidence or simply their ease in the environment made him feel like a visitor in a place he believed was supposed to be his. The police academy had been different. The academy was a place where everything was structured, where your position was explicit, where performance was measured by the metrics. He excelled at speed of decision, physical confidence, the ability to walk into a situation and assert control before the situation asserted anything back at him. He had graduated in the top quarter of his class and arrived in Millwood County at 24 years old, with the clean uniform and the uncomplicated certainty of someone who had found the environment in which all his instincts aligned with the requirements. 18 years later, the uniform had more creases and the certainty had only deepened. The way certainty deepens in people who have never been required to seriously question it. The 8 complaints were facts he was aware of the way a person is aware of minor weather. Things that had happened and then, through the reliable operation of a protective structure he had never fully needed to examine, because it had never failed, had stopped happening. Sergeant Dale Fenton had been the reliable constant of that structure. Fenton had been on the force for 30 years, and in those 30 years, he had developed a specific and highly useful skill, which was making things go away before they became problems that required difficult conversations or formal findings, or any of the other bureaucratic machinery that slowed down a department's ability to operate with the efficiency Fenton believed was its primary obligation. 8 complaints. Not one formal disciplinary finding. This morning, Pruitt had been 2 miles from Millwood Memorial on his way to a routine patrol when he saw 3 luxury cars turn through the iron gates. He had made the calculation in approximately the time it took to set his coffee in the cup holder and open his door. It was the only calculation he had made every day for 18 years, and it had never once landed him anywhere he hadn't been able to walk away from intact. He did not check the public burial registry listed on the county website. He did not consult Kenny Ashford. He did not radio dispatch. He got out of the cruiser and walked across the east lawn toward Section 14 with the specific, unhurried confidence of a man who has never once arrived somewhere and found himself wrong. Back at the graveside, standing on the east lawn with Nadine's arm in his grip and her wrists now in the handcuffs he had applied with a practiced efficiency that carried in it every time he had done this before, Pruitt felt the familiar solidity of control returning to the situation. This was the part he knew. This was the part where he was in charge of what happened next. People like you, he had said, and he had meant it in the comprehensive way. He always meant it the way a statement can carry 18 years of history in 4 syllables, the entire architecture of who he believed belonged on which side of the authority he represented. What he had not anticipated was that she would not react the way the calculation predicted. Most people, when he moved with that speed and that certainty, when the handcuffs came out and the voice hardened and the physical weight of his presence pressed into the space between them, most people recalibrated. They went quiet, or they went loud, they cried, or they bargained, or they stiffened, and gave him exactly the resistance he needed to justify the next step. The response was the proof of the assumption, and the assumption was always the same, and the loop had completed cleanly every time for 18 years. Nadine did none of those things. She stood completely still. She allowed him to apply the cuffs without any movement that could be characterized as resistance. And then she said in the same quiet, precise voice she had used throughout, "I am not resisting. I want that noted, and I want your badge number." 247, Pruitt said, with the ease of a man who had given out this number before and watched absolutely nothing come of it. "File whatever you want, sweetheart. Let me know how that works out for you." He said it loud enough for the gathering to hear. He said it because he wanted them to hear it, because the audience was part of the performance, because the performance was how you maintained the standard, and the standard was how this sector had stayed what it was supposed to be for the 18 years he had been the one holding it. He had no idea, standing on the east lawn of Millwood Memorial, with a federal appellate judge in handcuffs at her son's open grave, speaking with the breezy contempt of a man who had never once been held to account that he was delivering himself. That every word he had just said in front of 22 witnesses, including a young officer who had already opened a notebook, was being received not as authority, but as evidence. That the architecture of 18 years was not as he believed still standing. That it had, in the moment the cuffs closed, begun to come apart at every joint. He turned and started walking her toward the perimeter road. "I am not resisting," Nadine said for the second time, and her voice did not shake. "I want that noted, and I want your badge number." The cuffs were too tight. Kenny Ashford, standing 3 paces behind Pruitt, saw it the moment the steel closed. Saw the skin at her wrist bones compress the gap between the cuff and her skin, insufficient the particular quality of pressure that speaks to deliberateness rather than accident. He saw her jaw tighten, one involuntary reflex, the body's honest response to pain, and then smooth deliberately back to stillness. A woman overriding her own nerve endings through the same kind of focused discipline that had gotten her through every difficult thing in a long professional life full of difficult things. He opened his notebook. He wrote the time 9:55 a.m. He wrote what he had seen. Pruitt put his hand on Nadine's shoulder and began steering her away from the grave, past the chrome lowering device, past the sunflower spray yellow still brilliant against the flat December sky resting across her son's urn. Past Pastor Cole, who stood with his Bible still open at the 23rd Psalm, unable to speak, because there are in fact no words written for this particular interruption. Past James, who had his phone out and was recording with hands that were visibly shaking. Past 2 more of Elijah's college friends, both recording, both silent, the specific silence of people absorbing something that they will be trying to understand for the rest of their lives. Past Mrs. Ruth Malone, who had her handkerchief pressed to her mouth and whose shoulders were moving with the particular grief of a woman watching something she has been afraid of. Her whole long life happened to someone she loves, with the specific helplessness of not being able to stop it. And past Mrs. Odessa Carmichael, who drew herself up to her full height and called out Nadine in a voice that broke cleanly on the second syllable, the way a voice breaks when it is trying to carry more weight than a voice was designed to hold. "Step back," Pruitt said to her without breaking stride. Or you're next. Nadine looked back once, the sunflowers on the urn, yellow against the gray. Her son's urn still above the earth, the service unfinished, Marcus still waiting. She memorized it. Then she turned forward and walked. The east lawn of Millwood Memorial Gardens to the perimeter road was perhaps 150 yards. It felt much longer. Nadine walked without stumbling, without rushing, without performing dignity in any way that was not simply her natural carriage moving through a set of circumstances that no carriage should ever have to accommodate. Wrists cuffed behind her black wool coat, still belted veil still down, the posture of a woman who has walked into every difficult room in her professional life with her weight over her feet and her eyes on where she was going because that was the only posture she had ever known. Behind her, the gathering at Section 14 did not move. They stood in the December cold with the specific immobility of people who have been doing the impossible math of intervention versus survival their entire lives, who know in the way that experience teaches cellular and unchosen that the math does not reliably come out in their favor. The phones were still recording. Mrs. Malone was still weeping. Mrs. Carmichael stood with her shoulders squared and her fists closed at her sides, and her eyes fixed on the back of Nadine's coat, with an expression that was built from equal parts fury and love, and the particular helplessness of a woman who has lived long enough to recognize an injustice she cannot stop. James lowered his phone once, started to step forward, then stopped. The mathematics again. The calculation that people like James had been running their entire lives and that had no good solution when the man walking away had a badge and a gun and 18 years of a system that had never once looked at him and found something requiring correction. Kenny Ashford walked a few steps behind Pruitt, holding the rear door of the cruiser when they reached it. He did not speak. He kept his face at the careful surface of a man who is managing something significant underneath it, who has been trained to present nothing that could be read as challenge or dissent, and who is currently, for the first time in 3 years on this force, questioning whether that training serves the thing it claims to serve. Nadine got into the back seat without assistance. She positioned herself upright not for appearance, but because upright was simply how she occupied every space she had ever been placed in, regardless of what that space was doing to her at the time. Through the rain-streaked rear window, she could still see Section 14. The chrome of the lowering device catching the flat December light. The yellow of the sunflowers. Her son's urn still above the earth. Still waiting. She turned away from the window. She looked at the back of Wade Pruitt's neck, flushed at the collar, carrying itself with the ease of a man who fully expects to win whatever he has just started. And she began quietly and precisely to catalog everything. She built it the way Elijah had built his hallways. With care, with generosity for what it would need to hold, and with the complete certainty that it was going to stand. The time she first stated the permit number 9:53 a.m. The specific words, permit number WC 4471, filed with Millwood County. 8 days ago, registered on the public schedule for 10 o'clock this morning. Clear, audible, formal. The time she stated it a second time, still 9:53 a.m. The instruction to stay where she was, 9:54 a.m. The handcuff application, 9:55 a.m. 22 seconds. She counted backward from the closing click of the steel to the last word she had spoken before it, and the number was 22. And she filed that number in the same precise mental architecture where she kept everything that was going to matter later. The cuffs were too tight. She could feel the circulation in her left hand diminishing already, the particular tingling that precedes numbness when steel presses against bone without adequate gap. She registered the sensation with the clinical attention of a woman cataloging an injury for documentation and did not allow it to register anywhere else. In the front seat, Kenny Ashford looked at his own hands. Then out the window at the wide tree-lined Millwood County roads, the lawns set back at a distance that communicated something specific about insulation. From consequence, the careful management of who experienced what in this particular landscape. Then at his hands again. He was thinking about his notebook. about the time he had written down and the words he had reconstructed and the skin at her wrist bones that he had watched compress when the steel closed. He was thinking about the voice Pruitt had used when he said, "Let me know how that works out for you, sweetheart." The voice of a man who has said this to people before, many times before, and has always been right that nothing would come of it. He was thinking about whether that was going to be true this time. He did not yet know what she was, but he knew what he had seen. And he was the kind of person who had not yet learned to unknow things which was either his most significant professional liability or the most important thing about him, and he did not yet know which. Pruitt drove. The county roads ran wide and clean ahead of them. The coffee was cold in his cup holder. He had no idea he had made the last uncorrected mistake of his career. The Millwood County precinct smelled of industrial cleaning fluid and old coffee, and the particular staleness of a building maintained for function rather than comfort. The intake area, with its raised laminate counter and scratched plastic partition and fluorescent overhead that rendered every person standing beneath it in the same flat institutional light, was the room where things got processed and filed, and if you knew the right people and the right procedures and how to phrase certain notations in a certain way, quietly made to stop existing. Pruitt walked Nadine through the main door with the practiced ease of a man completing a transaction he has completed many times before. Two officers near the water cooler. Hal Torres and a younger man named Ferris looked up with the specific attention of people who read Pruitt's arrivals as performances for which they are the guaranteed audience. "What did you bring in?" "Dangerous trespasser." Pruitt steered Nadine toward the counter without slowing. "Refused to. ID refused a lawful order. Resisted cemetery up in the Millwood sector." A pause that was precisely timed, that pause he had perfected over 18 years. You know how it is. The laugh from the water cooler was immediate and reflexive. The laugh of people who have laughed at smaller versions of this story enough times that the laughter requires no thought, no assessment, no examination of what they are actually laughing at, or who is standing 3 feet away receiving it. Sergeant Dale Fenton was in the break room refilling his coffee when Pruitt came in after depositing Nadine at the intake counter. Fenton was 55 years old, broad-shouldered, his hair gone fully silver, his face carrying the settled, confident color of a man who had been protected enough times to mistake that protection for a permanent condition of the world rather than a service being rendered to him by a specific structure he had helped build. Pruitt told him the cemetery story. The 3 cars, the group, the woman who had given him formal language when he asked a straightforward question, all that permit number, and I formally note talk like she was running a deposition instead of answering a cop. Fenton listened. He sipped his coffee. "You're fine, Carl." "She wasn't scared," Pruitt said, and there was something in his voice that he didn't quite recognize from himself, a small, unfamiliar quality. Most people, they get loud, or they go quiet, or they start crying. She just looked at me like she was taking notes. Fenton set his coffee down. "Name one time anything has stuck to you." The answer was the same it had always been. And Pruitt settled back against the counter, reassured. The floor felt solid beneath him. It had always been solid. Sergeant Raymond Odom was 52 years old and had spent 23 years behind intake counters, learning a specific distinction that he would describe if asked as the difference between assumption and reading. Assumption was what you brought to a situation before you looked at it. Reading was what the situation told you when you were quiet enough to hear it. He considered it the most important professional skill he possessed, and he had spent 23 years sharpening it. He looked at the woman Pruitt was steering toward his counter, late 50s, dressed with a quiet precision that had survived being walked across a cemetery in December rain. Mud at the left cuff of her coat, but the coat itself the kind of quality that does not rumple under pressure. Her wrists were in cuffs, and he could see from his position at the elevated counter that they had been applied too tightly, the skin at both wrist bones already showing the beginning of the bruising that comes when steel meets bone with inadequate space between them. And she was standing with a posture that, in 23 years of intake work, he had never once encountered. Not defiance, not fear, not the blank, shell-shocked absence of someone who has been through this before. She was standing with the posture of someone who is in complete command of what is happening and is waiting with considerable patience for what is happening to understand this. Her eyes met his. Odom felt the floor drop approximately 6 inches. "Name," he said, and his voice came out quieter than he intended. "She wouldn't give it," Pruitt said, sliding the intake form across the counter. "Book her Jane Doe until she cooperates. Trespassing, refusing a lawful order, resisting. I'll finish the report before end of shift." Odom looked at Pruitt. He looked at the woman. He looked back at Pruitt. "I'll need to hear that from her," he said. Pruitt blinked. "My vehicle is a dark green Mercedes." The woman's voice was clear and even, and entirely without performance, the voice of someone who has spent decades ensuring that what she says is heard correctly the first time, every time. "It is registered to Nadine DeWitt. It is parked in the Millwood Memorial Guest Lane. My credentials are in the glove compartment. I asked Officer Pruitt twice to allow me to retrieve them at the scene. He denied both requests. I am requesting now that those credentials be retrieved immediately." A pause. The pause of someone covering the necessary ground in the proper order. "I am also formally noting that the handcuffs have been applied too tightly and that I have significant discomfort and some loss of circulation in my left hand." The water cooler area had gone completely silent. Odom looked at her wrists. He looked at her face. He picked up the intake form and set it back down without writing a single word on it. He looked at Pruitt. "Go get the credentials, Wade. She's being processed. Go get the credentials." Odom's voice did not change in volume or temperature. It was simply the voice of a man who has decided something is going to happen and does not require the room's agreement. "Now," Pruitt calculated. He chose deferral. He turned and walked back through the main door, and the room exhaled in the specific way that rooms exhale when a pressure source has briefly left the building. Odom reached under the counter for the cuff key. The 2 water cooler officers had found urgent business elsewhere. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead indifferent, illuminating everything equally. Pruitt returned with the credentials, set them on the counter in front of Odom, and because Odom took them without opening them immediately and began making a phone call that Pruitt couldn't read, drifted back toward the break room where the audience was more reliable. Fenton was still there. So was Ferris eating a sandwich at the table in the corner and Torres leaning against the counter. The room had the quality of the tail end of something people who have laughed at a situation settling back into the ordinariness of the day. Pruitt told Fenton about the phone call, about the way Odom was handling it, about the woman's voice at the intake counter, still that same formal, careful language I formally note, still not scared, still not performing any of the expected responses. "You know what bothers me about it?" Pruitt said, and he was aware that he was saying something he would not normally say, that the small, unfamiliar quality from earlier had not gone away the way he expected it to. Most people, when it gets to the intake desk, they either fold or they escalate. She did neither. She just kept going with that voice, like she was somewhere else entirely and just waiting for the situation to catch up. Fenton's response was the patient response of a man who has delivered this particular reassurance before and finds the need for repetition tedious rather than alarming. He laid out the structure of protection clearly and without dramatics. The union, the internal process, the track record that constituted in 18 years of application a perfect record of things not sticking. Carl Fenton said nothing sticks to you. You know that. In the corner, Kenny Ashford was looking at his sandwich without eating it. He had heard the intake exchange from across the room before Pruitt came in. He had seen the woman at the counter. He had seen with the specific clarity of someone young enough to still be looking at things clearly rather than through the filter of an established interpretation the bruising around her cuffs. The particular bluish beginning of it against her darker skin sitting there in the fluorescent light like a fact that did not need anyone to name it. He thought about saying something. He gave it 4 full seconds. Then he looked at Fenton's posture at Torres, shifting his weight near the door at the easy, settled confidence of the room, and he looked back at his sandwich. The intercom crackled. Sergeant Odom requesting Lieutenant Fenton to the front desk immediately. Fenton's coffee mug stopped halfway to his mouth. Odom had opened the credential wallet the way you open something when you already suspect what it contains and you want your hands to be perfectly steady when you find out. He set it flat on the counter. He unfolded it. He looked. The federal seal first. Gold embossed on dark leather. The kind of precise, unambiguous detail that communicates exactly what category of authority it represents and does not expect to justify itself to anyone looking at it. The kind of thing you see once and do not subsequently wonder about. Below the seal in this credential window, a photograph that matched the woman standing across the counter from him, the same face, the same particular quality, in the eyes that quality he had noticed and could not name. The quality of someone who has been waiting at considerable personal cost for someone in this building to simply look at what was in front of them and see it accurately. A name in crisp official type, and below the name, the title. The Honorable Nadine DeWitt, Judge, United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. Odom set the wallet on the counter with the deliberateness of a man setting down something that might break things if it landed wrong. He looked up at Nadine. She met his gaze and gave one small, steady nod. Not triumphant, not vindicated, containing nothing of, "I told you so," or "now you understand." The nod of a woman who has been waiting at enormous personal cost for someone in this building to simply look at what was in front of them and see it correctly. The nod of a woman who has been doing that, has been holding that posture from the east lawn of Millwood Memorial through 150 yards, and a cruiser and a fluorescent intake desk. Odom picked up the desk phone. He was aware of every person in the room. Torres Ferris, the young officer Ashford near the door, all of them now in positions that would require them to decide later what they had seen and what they were going to do with having seen it. He was aware of the intake form with nothing written on it. He was aware of the bruising on the wrists of a sitting federal appellate judge who had been handcuffed at her son's burial by one of his department's officers 45 minutes ago. He dialed Fenton's extension. His voice, when Fenton answered, came out 2 full registers below its normal pitch. "Lieutenant Fenton. Front desk. Right now." He hung up. He looked at Torres and held the look until Torres found somewhere urgent to be. Then he looked at Nadine, and something in the quality of his attention had shifted the way a room shifts when someone decides to simply face what is there rather than manage around it. "I'm going to have the cuffs removed," he said. "I need to make a call. Can I get you anything?" Nadine said. "Thank you, Sergeant." And it was only the slight additional weight on the word sergeant, the precise acknowledgement of his rank and his professionalism, and the distinction he had just made between himself and the officer who had brought her here, that acknowledged anything at all. Nothing beyond that. She did not give him more than what the moment required because she had been trained by 2 decades on a federal bench and a lifetime before it to give exactly what the moment required and nothing beyond it. Dale Fenton came through the door with his coffee still in his hand and the practiced expression of a man prepared to smooth something over the same expression he had worn successfully 8 times before in situations involving Pruitt's name and an upset party, and a process that needed to reach a conclusion that suited everyone except the person at the center of it. He came around the counter. He picked up the credential wallet. He looked at it. The color left his face not all at once, but in stages, the way certainty leaves when it discovers it has been standing on nothing. The shoulders first, then the jaw, then the specific quality in his eyes that had been carrying 30 years of accumulated professional confidence and which was now carrying something that had no name in Fenton's vocabulary because he had spent those 30 years ensuring he would never need to name it. He was still holding the wallet when Wade Pruitt came through from the break room following the silence, the way you follow a sound you don't recognize pulled toward it by the specific dread of not knowing being worse than knowing. He saw Fenton's face. He stopped walking. Something in his chest quit. Not a skipped beat in absence. A full, complete cessation, the kind that makes you aware of your own heartbeat for a fractured second before it lurches back wrong. The coffee cup he'd been carrying was still in his hand. He realized he could no longer feel his fingers wrapped around it. His mouth went dry in the particular way that happens when the body understands something 3 seconds before the mind will allow it. He looked at the wallet in Fenton's hand. He looked at Odom's face. He looked at the woman at the counter, the black wool coat, the mud at the left cuff, the wrist bones where the steel had been. And for the first time in the entire morning, he actually looked at her, not to assess, not to manage, not to calculate the arithmetic of who belonged where. He looked at her the way you look at something when you have been seeing it wrong this entire time, and the correct version has just arrived and cannot be returned. Nadine did not move. She did not speak. She met his gaze and held it with an expression that contained nothing he could use, no satisfaction, no anger, no mercy, no cruelty. The expression of a woman who has already made every decision that needs making and is simply waiting for the room to finish catching up to what she has known since 9:55 this morning. She held it for 5 full seconds. Pruitt said in a voice that came out wrong, too high, too much air behind it. The voice of a man whose instrument of authority has just failed him completely. She wasn't carrying ID. She refused to provide her name. Standard contact protocol. Fenton cut him off. He set the credential wallet on the counter with a careful, deliberate click, the sound of someone placing something down and stepping back from it. He looked at it. He looked at Pruitt. And then, in the flat, emptied voice of a man doing arithmetic, "He desperately wishes he weren't doing," he said. "Wade. You put a federal appellate judge in handcuffs at her son's burial on a public cemetery permit, and then you gave her your badge number and told her to file a complaint." The silence that followed was the heaviest thing in the room. Nadine let it breathe for 3 full seconds. Then in the exact same register she had used on the East Lawn level, unhurried, costing her nothing. "I'd like the name of your union representative, Officer Pruitt. You told me to file a complaint. I intend to be very thorough." Odom picked up the desk phone. Pruitt stood at the intake counter and felt the floor of 18 years begin to give way beneath him slowly, comprehensively, with no available exit in any direction he could see. She was released at 2:47 in the afternoon. A lieutenant she had not seen before came to the intake desk and spoke to her in the careful, over-precise language of a man managing a situation he does not yet fully understand and is deeply afraid of compounding. She listened to his apologies. She accepted the return of her credentials and her purse. She requested and received the incident number, the intake form with nothing written on it, and formal written notation of badge number 247. She had that number already. She asked for it anyway, so that the asking would be in the record. She drove back to Millwood Memorial Gardens. The burial party was long gone. The December light was thinning toward dusk, the east lawn quiet and gray. A groundskeeper moving between distant sections with the unhurried pace of someone for whom other people's worst days are simply the ordinary texture of a day's work. She parked in the guest lane and walked across the grass to section 14, row 9. The grave was closed. Pastor Cole had returned on his own 20 minutes after the cruiser left without being asked, with the quiet determination of a man who understood that a service interrupted by wrong is still a service that needs finishing, and had completed the burial alone, lowering the urn himself with a care that no one was there to witness, but that mattered anyway. The sunflower spray was still there. Rain flattened slightly in the hours since morning, but still yellow, vivid, and unambiguous against the headstone that bore her son's name and the 2 dates that no mathematics of fairness could explain. Nadine stood at the grave for a long time. She spoke to him quietly. She told him what had happened, not softening any of it because Elijah had never needed anything softened. She told him she was sorry the service had been interrupted. She told him the sunflowers had stayed. Then she rolled up her left sleeve. 2 bands of darkening skin at the level of her wrist bones, the bruising deep enough now to carry its own weight. The marks of steel applied against bone with deliberate force at her son's graveside on a Wednesday morning in December. She looked at them without addition, without subtraction, seeing the thing itself. She rolled her sleeve down. She took out her phone and called her law clerk. "Sandra," she said, "I need the name of the best civil rights attorney in the Fourth Circuit who doesn't have a case before my court. I need it by tomorrow morning." Kenny Ashford sat at his kitchen table at 11:30 that night with his personal notebook open and a pen in his hand. He had joined the Millwood County Police Department 3 years ago because he had believed with the specific, untested sincerity of someone whose beliefs had not yet been properly examined that law enforcement was a service. He was still in the process of finding out what it was, and tonight the process had taken a turn he had not anticipated. He wrote what Pruitt had said on the drive to Millwood Memorial that morning, the exact words reconstructed as precisely as memory allowed. Nobody holds the line anymore. People show up where they don't belong and nobody says anything. Somebody has to be the standard. He wrote the timeline. 9:48 a.m. Pruitt exits the cruiser with no radio contact, no registry check, no partner consultation. 9:53 a.m. First credential statement by the subject, clear and audible. 9:54 a.m. Second credential statement, clear and audible. Pruitt's instruction to stay put. 9:55 a.m. Handcuff application. He wrote both of her statements verbatim from memory, the way a person writes something they are not going to be allowed to forget. He wrote the specific words of people like you always think they're the exception because those words had a particular texture that had been sitting in his chest all day and that he knew would not leave him on their own. He wrote what he had seen at the intake desk, the bruising at both wrists, the color and location, the distance he had been standing close enough to see clearly in fluorescent light. He looked at what he had written for a long time. He thought about Fenton's voice in the break room name one time. Anything has stuck to you. The way it sounded like a promise, the person making it believed completely. He thought about the 2 officers near the water cooler who had laughed before they knew what they were laughing at. He thought about the woman at the intake counter and what it cost. He could see what it cost. It was visible if you were willing to look directly at it. He closed the notebook. He picked up his phone. He looked up the number for the FBI field office in Richmond. He set the phone down. He picked it up again. He dialed. The federal courthouse in Richmond filled from before the doors opened on the morning of the trial. The line extended down the courthouse steps and around the block by 7:30. Press from 4 states. Legal observers from 3 law schools with notebooks already open. Community members from Beaufort County, where Elijah's last community center stood with its south-facing windows and its front porches and the ceramic planters flanking the main entrance where in the spring sunflowers grew because he had put them in the first draft of the blueprint and never changed them. Mrs. Odessa Carmichael and Mrs. Ruth Malone had seats in the 3rd row. They had arrived before dawn. Wade Pruitt sat at the defense table in civilian clothes, his attorney's strategy aimed at making him appear smaller, less institutional, less like the accumulated weight of what the record described. He had lost weight in the month since December. His face had the quality of a man who has not slept well in a long time, and who has recently begun to understand why. Federal prosecutor Sandra Reeves stood at the government's podium and looked at the jury for a full moment before she said anything. Then she said, "A mother came to bury her son. She had a permit. 9 minutes. No gestures, no flourishes, no performance. Just the record laid before the jury with the care of someone who understands that the facts presented with clarity are the argument. The Cedarwood Burial Registry. The permit number. The body camera footage time-stamped in the corner with the precision of a system that had kept running even when the man wearing it had stopped thinking about what it was recording. The footage played on a screen large enough for the back row to read the draft mark clearly. 29 minutes and 41 seconds uncut, uninterrupted. The gallery watched in the silence of people who know exactly what is coming and find that knowing does not make it easier. The moment Pastor Cole's voice stopped mid-verse was audible in the room. Day 2. Kenny Ashford took the stand in his full uniform, pressed the night before, with the attention of someone who understands that how you arrive somewhere tells the room something about what you believe is required of you. He was 26 years old. He opened his personal notebook on the stand, and when Sandra Reeves asked him to describe the morning of December 4th, he read from it in the flat, precise voice of someone providing a factual account of facts he had documented at the time they occurred. He read what Pruitt had said on the drive to Millwood Memorial. He read the timeline with every timestamp he had recorded. He read both of Nadine's credential statements reconstructed verbatim in the same measured cadence they had been delivered in. He read his description of the handcuff application and his observation of the bruising at the intake desk, the color, the location, the distance he had been standing, which was close enough to see clearly in fluorescent light. The gallery was very quiet. The defense attorney stood and asked Ashford in the tone of a man who is not confident in his question, but must ask something whether he understood what he was doing, whether he understood what it meant in practice for a career in law enforcement to testify against a fellow officer. Ashford looked at the attorney for a moment the way you look at someone when their question has missed something essential. "I understand what my job is," he said. "My job is to the law, not to the person standing next to me." A sound moved through the gallery, not quite audible, entirely present. The weight of a room that has been holding something and is beginning carefully to put it down. In the third row, Mrs. Odessa Carmichael pressed her handkerchief to her mouth. Not grief exactly. Something more than grief. The specific feeling of watching someone very young do a very difficult thing in front of everyone, and do it without flinching. Nadine at the complainant's table did not look at Ashford. She looked at the middle distance with her hands folded, the same quality of stillness she had carried from the east lawn of Millwood Memorial through every room she had moved through since that morning. The stillness of someone who is holding the whole weight of a thing from outside it so that it does not consume her, so that she remains exactly who she is, regardless of what the room is doing. She remained. She had been remaining since 9:55 in the morning. She had been remaining since the handcuffs clicked. She had been remaining since Pruitt turned and walked her past the sunflowers with his hand on her shoulder, and she had remained through everything, and she was still here, and that the jury would later say in several different ways was the thing they could not stop thinking about. Day 3. Pruitt's attorney walked him through the account, slowly building the language of the incident report into a verbal structure non-compliant, resisting, refused, repeated lawful commands. Pruitt delivered the words with less conviction than he had written them, because he had now sat in this courtroom for 2 full days and heard his own body camera audio played in the room where a federal judge had been handcuffed, and had a precise sense of how much distance remained between his version and the record. Sandra Reeves stood up. She did not hurry. She stood at the podium and took a moment to organize her papers, and the moment was deliberate, the kind of pause that gives a jury time to look at a man and let what they already know about him settle before the next question opens new ground. Then she asked him to point out the combative behavior in the footage from 9:48 to 9:53 a.m. The footage ran. The east lawn, the gathering, his own voice interrupting the psalm. Nadine, turning the badge, the permit number, the public schedule, the request to lower his voice. Reeves paused it. "Where is the combative behavior?" She ran the segment from 9:53. Nadine's voice filled the courtroom clear and formal. The registration of the vehicle, the location of the credentials, the 2 requests denied. Is that a refusal to provide identification? Pruitt. She didn't present physical. Reeves held up the body camera still. Timestamp 9:55:14. Wrist bones, steel, skin compressing. This image is time-stamped 22 seconds after her second credential statement. In those 22 seconds, what did she do that constituted non-compliance? The defense attorney's pen had stopped moving 2 questions ago. Pruitt looked at the photograph. He looked at the timestamp. He looked at the jury and found in their faces nothing that was going to help him. She didn't present physical identification, he said, and even he could hear what it sounded like in the room. Reeves set the photograph down. No further questions. The jury was out for 3 hours and 58 minutes. When the foreperson stood a woman in her mid-40s who had taken careful notes in a small spiral-bound notebook every single day of the trial, she delivered the findings in the clear, settled voice of someone who has had sufficient time to be entirely certain. Guilty. Violation of civil rights under color of law. Guilty. Excessive force. Guilty. False arrest. Guilty. Falsification of a police incident report. Each count read separately, each one landing in the gallery with its own particular weight. And by the fourth, the room was no longer holding the silence it had been holding. It was releasing something slowly and carefully, the way you release something you have been carrying with both hands for a very long time. Dale Fenton, who had entered a cooperation agreement with the prosecution 3 months before trial, lost his pension, his rank, and 30 years in Millwood County law enforcement. He would not stand beside Pruitt when the sentence was handed down. He had stopped returning Pruitt's calls in January. Pruitt received 4 years in federal custody, permanent forfeiture of his law enforcement pension, and permanent revocation of his law enforcement certification in the state of Virginia. Nadine DeWitt did not stand up. She did not turn to the gallery. She sat very still in her chair at the complainant's table, the same quality of stillness as the east lawn, as the intake counter, as every room she had moved through correctly for 21 years, and she breathed one full breath in and out, deliberately. She unclenched her hands. She had not realized until that moment that she had been holding them closed. She looked at the case file folder in front of her, and she let the verdict be exactly and only what it was. Kenny Ashford resigned from the Millwood County Police Department the week after the verdict. He enrolled in law school at the University of Maryland that fall, concentrating in civil rights and constitutional law. He wrote Nadine a letter 8 months later, 2 handwritten pages asking for nothing, describing only what he had seen and what it had cost him to sit with it, and what he had eventually decided to do with the weight of it. She read it twice. She wrote back on a single page in the small, precise handwriting of a woman who says exactly what she means, and nothing beyond it. Millwood County signed a federal consent decree within the year. Independent civilian oversight. Mandatory body cameras with non-negotiable retention schedules. An independent review process for internal affairs findings that bypassed the department entirely. The Virginia State Legislature, citing DeWitt versus County of Millwood as controlling authority, passed mandatory body camera legislation for every county law enforcement agency in the state. The attorney who drafted the key provisions noted in her remarks that the case had prevailed not because of legal complexity, but because the record had been complete. A camera that kept running. A notebook filled at a kitchen table at 11:30 at night. Clarity in the end was the thing that no amount of institutional protection could outlast. The Elijah DeWitt Foundation for Civil Justice opened on Meeting Street in Columbia in a building Elijah had designed with the south-facing windows he had specified, and the front porches he had called a political statement, and the ceramic planters flanking the entrance, where in the spring sunflowers grew, because he had put them there and no one had ever had a reason to take them out. One morning in early spring, Nadine drove to Millwood Memorial alone. She carried sunflowers. She walked across the east lawn, which was green now, and unhurried the December mud long erased. She placed the flowers against the headstone and stood there until she was ready. Then she got in her car, drove back to the courthouse, went up to her chambers, sat down at her desk, and opened the next file. She began to read. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that dignity cannot be handcuffed, and that truth documented clearly outlasts every wall built to contain it, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story about people who refused to be broken. Tell us in the comments what moment hit you hardest. We read every single one.